Hello, welcome to our third article that we'll be reading for the Wild West unit. We're going to turn our attention to the railroad and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. All right, here we go. Rails across the country. It was May 10th, 1869, and hardly a person in the whole country didn't wish to be at Promontory Point in Utah. The people who were there listened to speeches, said a prayer, drank toasts, too many it was said, yelled and cheered. Two brass bands blared. All over the country, newspapers held their presses so they could cover the grand event. The newspapers wouldn't tell the whole story. It would take years for the real story to be known. But when Leland Stanford, representing a railroad company that had laid tracks east from Sacramento, California, over the high and dangerous Sierra Nevada mountains and on to northern Utah, when Leland Stanford shook hands with Thomas Durant, whose railroad company had laid tracks west from Omaha, Nebraska, overland the Indians thought they owned, why the whole country got excited. A telegraph operator on a high pole above the crowd sent out the message, "Stand by, we have done praying." Then Stanford raised a silver hammer, whomped at a solid gold spike, and missed. No matter, the next swipe hit the nail on the head. 5 states had sent gold and silver spikes for this historic event, so the other bigwigs each got a chance to hammer away. When they were done, Chinese workmen quietly removed the fancy spikes and nailed regular ones in place. By that time, the news had been sent to America's newspapers and people. Transcontinental Railroad completed, east and west linked. I think that'd be a funny thing to put on a test, right? So let's talk about how they used a silver hammer and whomped a solid gold spike. There we go. That's a great test question. Easy to remember. Of course, then they pulled it out and used the regular steel ones to complete the railroad. In Philadelphia, the Liberty Bell rang. Chicago held a parade that stretched for 7 miles. In New York, cannons blasted 100 times. You could now go by train from New York to California. All right, let's do the captions on this page. And hopefully you should have highlighted the "Then Stanford raised a silver hammer, whomped at a solid gold spike, and missed. No matter, the next swipe hit the nail on his head." So you could highlight that and about the using the gold spikes. Up at the top left, a poster and the caption, "The great event was the joining of 2 railroad lines, making it possible to go from coast to coast." Down below at the bottom left, "For more on this subject, read Stephen Ambrose's book, Nothing Like It in the World, The Men Who Built the Transcontinental Railroad, 1863 to 1869, Simon & Schuster." Finally, the caption under the picture, "This all-time record was the result of a bet between 2 of the railroad owners. 10 miles of track laid in one day, April 28th, 1869. Okay, let's go back to the article and go over to page 2 of the article. The building of that railroad had begun in a way on July 1st, 1862, the day Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act. They were visionaries, people with clear sight and imagination, who had talked even earlier of a railroad to cross the country. Lincoln's Act got it started, but slowly. After all, there was a civil war being fought. The country learned of the importance of railroads during that war, when armies were moved by train. But a railroad that stretched across the continent, that would have to wait until the war was over. 2 companies built the railroad, the Central Pacific starting in the west, and the Union Pacific coming from the east. You can highlight that sentence. Highlight the Central Pacific starting in the west and the Union Pacific coming from the east. No one knew exactly where they would meet. It became a race, east against west. It was an important race for those who owned the railroad companies. The government was giving subsidies for each mile of railway track that was laid. So, of course, each side wanted to lay the most track. Under the best conditions, laying track isn't easy. Conditions were rarely best. Remember, this was frontier land they were crossing. The railroads had to bring all their supplies with them. If there was an emergency, there was no place to go for help. You lay tracks by putting heavy metal rails on top of wooden cross pieces, trimmed logs, called ties. The Union Pacific used 40 railroad cars to haul the 400 tons of rails, timber, fuel, and food needed for each mile of track. The Central Pacific brought its rails, locomotives, and supplies from the East Coast on clipper ships that sailed around to Cape Horn at the tip of South America. Laying tracks on flat land is not too difficult, but try crossing a mountain. You have a choice. You can go over or through. The railroad men did both of those things. They dug tunnels through some mountains and laid tracks over others. At first, the equipment they used was about as fancy as what you might find in a neighbor's garage. Workers attacked rocks with pickaxes, they dug tunnels with shovels and their bare hands. They carried stones and dirt in wheelbarrows. Sometimes they used explosives. Sometimes they blew themselves up. Some pictures here. First caption. After the Golden Spike was driven home, the Union Pacific engineer, General Grenville Dodge, a distinguished Union veteran of the Civil War, shook hands with the Central Pacific engineer, Samuel Montague. Bottom right, a subsidy is a grant of money, land, or something of value. The railroads got valuable land grants. Let's flip over to the next page. Do you want to build a railroad, 19th century style? Start with graders, men with picks, shovels, wheelbarrows, and wagons. They grade the land, making it as level as possible. Muscular track layers follow. They lift and place the heavy wooden ties and the heavy metal rails. Next come the gaugers, spikers, and bolters, who get it all together and hammer the spikes in place. Each rail takes 10 spikes, and each mile, 400 rails. The Pacific Railroad sent ships to China and brought 7,000 Chinese workers to California just to build the railroad. They paid them $1 a day. The Chinese worked incredibly hard for long hours and mostly were treated with contempt. Coming the other way on the Union Pacific, most workers were either ex-Confederate soldiers, former slaves, or Irish immigrants. They too worked hard. They lived in tent cities put up and down as the railroad went west. Those moving towns were tough, violent places where there was too much drinking and too many guns. There was a constant fear of Indian raids. Before we go on, let's do our 1,000 Yippies. In a book called Chinaman, Maxine Hong Kingston writes about her ancestors who came from China and helped build the railroad. Over on the left, underneath the picture. There were 2 days that Ah Goon did cheer and throw his hat in the air, jumping up and down and screaming, "Yippee!" like a cowboy. 1, the day his team broke through the tunnel at last. The second day the Chinamen cheered was when the engine from the west and the one from the east rolled toward one another and touched. The Transcontinental Railroad was finished. They yippied like madmen. The white demon officials gave speeches. The greatest feat of the 19th century, they said. The greatest feat in the history of mankind, they said. Only Americans could have done it, they said, which is true. Ah, if Agun had not spent half his gold on citizenship papers, he was an American for having built the railroad. A white demon in top hat tapped on the gold spike and pulled it back out. Then one Chinaman held the real spike, the steel one, and another hammered it in. While the demons posed for photographs, the Chinamen dispersed. It was dangerous to stay. The driving out had begun. Back to our article. The Indians. The Indians by treaty had been guaranteed land west of the 95th meridian. The meridian is a line of longitude as a permanent home. When the railroad got to Nebraska, it was already at the 100th meridian. So Indians understandably were angered. They hated that thundering locomotives that were destroying the buffalo ranges. Native Americans raided the railroad camps, but not as often as the tales say. Indians didn't kill many train men. It was disease, accidents, avalanches, heat, and cold that were the worst killers. Some people deserved medals for what they accomplished, especially the engineers and organizers who arranged for food and shelter, who planned the route, and who supervised the work. None of that was easy. They did it with incredible speed. After the railroads met at Promontory Point, everyone had to wait 2 days to celebrate. That was because Thomas Durant was late. Union Pacific workerman had chained his fancy parlor car train to some railroad track. They kept him hostage until he paid them overdue wages. How about that? That'd be a fun paragraph to highlight, because what a funny test question to remember. So I highlighted after the railroads met all the way down to wages. There's kind of a funny test question there about how they got Thomas Durant to pay them their money they were due. By that time, Durant was rich enough to make King Midas envious. So was Leland Stanford, who made his employees salute. Let's do the captions before we go on. Underneath the big picture at the top, it's the winter of 1868. The Union Pacific crews have just crossed Wyoming's Green River in the shadow of Citadel Rock and the Wasatch Range. On the other side of the mountains lie Utah, the Great Salt Lake, and Promontory Point. Down at the bottom right, a couple were married while the cars were going at the rate of 30 miles an hour. Marital matters and things are becoming such a frequent occurrence on our railways that we suggest the keeping of train ministers and doctors to meet cases of emergency. Nebraska Herald, January 12th, 1871. Back to the article. Leland Stanford, who made his employees salute when he, next page, rode past in his private rail car. When the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, Stanford, Durant, and the other railroad tycoons were national heroes. Today, many historians call them crooks. You see, they had asked the government aid in building the railroad. That was reasonable. It was too big an undertaking for individuals. They demanded more money from the government. They wanted and got enormous and valuable land grants. That was greedy, but it wasn't illegal. Then they sold stock in their companies to the public and got more money that way. That wasn't illegal either. But when their companies gave out contracts for building the railroads, and those men in charge, Stanford, Durant, and company, took all the contracts for themselves, that was crooked. They didn't even share profits with their stockholders. That was really foul play. Worse than that, they charged the government twice what it actually cost to do the building. As you know, they hardly paid their workers. Let's do our captions here at the bottom left. Take a moment to check out that map at the top too about where the railroad went. Kind of cool. The captions at the bottom left. A private Pullman car, the rich could now travel in this style clear across the country. Back to the article. And still worse, they allowed poor and unsafe workmanship because it was cheaper and made their profits higher. So that side of it was a mess. When some of the story came out a few years later, it created a big scandal. That was when U.S. Grant was president. It almost destroyed his term in office. All the fuss did help get laws passed to regulate business greed. Still, to be fair, it took great imagination and some risk to finance the railroads. The men who did it had foresight and courage, even if they had no consideration for their employees, stockholders, or fellow citizens. The good part of the story is that people in the United States could now travel from coast to coast in 10 days. Some people still went west in covered wagons, but it wouldn't be long before the wagons were history. Soon there were several transcontinental railroads that were hauling things as well as people. Railroads made the United States into a united country. People from different parts of the nation got to know each other. New immigrants could go west and settle. People on the West Coast could meet relatives back east. And even if they didn't travel themselves, Americans could now buy goods from other states or talked to people who had traveled about. The railroad made the entire country seem smaller. Up at the top, underneath the big picture, Grant himself in straw hat and beard, hands on fence, came to settle a fight between Dodge, the engineer, far left, and his railroad owner, Durant, in a straw hat to the right of the top-hatted man. Durant wanted Dodge to make the railroad even longer than it had to be so he could gain more government subsidies. Dodge refused, and Grant backed him. And then over on the right, I'm going to let you guys read that one on your own, and we'll call it a wrap for the article called Rails Across the Country. All right, thanks for reading. Have a nice day.